I'd like to address process just very briefly, and that is that when we began this session of Congress, we were advised by our Republican colleagues that we were going to bring up each measure individually and discuss them. This is a structured rule that does contemplate the opportunity for many members to participate, but it isn't an open rule, and what it is it's a measure as the base bill that has cobbled to it 6 distinctly different measures, evidence the number of thank yous that had to come from Dr. Fox to the various committees. I do agree with the one, Dr. Fox, where you thanked the young man for creative thinking. This is out of the box when it comes to us as far as process is concerned, being creative. Cobbling 6 pieces of legislation with another to make 7 is a bit much. This rule provides for consideration of H.R. 4078, the Red Tape Reduction and Small Business Act of 2012, and H.R. 6082, which has such a long and convoluted name that the cost to the government to simply print the bill may require the Republican majority to raise the debt ceiling. What the red tape bill should be called, Mr. Speaker, is the Eliminate the Government's Ability to Protect Its Own Citizens Act of 2012, because that is what the radical legislation, creative though one may think it is, aims to do. Under this legislation, federal agencies would be prohibited from issuing new regulations until the unemployment rate falls below 6%. And I defy any economist or anybody else in the world to tell me when that's going to be in an economy such as the one that we have. So too would new regulations be prohibited between Election Day in early November and Inauguration Day in late January. For the past 2 years, the Republican majority has been spending its time doing everything, it seems to me, to crash the economy by defaulting on our debt, eliminating the greatest health care protections made in decades, and turning sensible decisions about women's health care into a fantasy of religious persecution. Now it appears that perhaps struggling Americans have finally managed to capture the Republicans' attention, except that the majority's response is not to make the kind of investments that will actually create jobs, but instead to gut the federal government's efforts to protect the health and safety of American citizens. I realize that in the fantasy world inhabited by some far-right ideologues, allowing polluters to run amok is tantamount to creating jobs. Allowing corporations to pursue fantastic profits at the expense of public health and safety is somehow good governance. And enabling the middle class to fall farther and farther behind the ultra-wealthy is somehow a shining example of the American spirit. But I have to ask, under this legislation, where will these new jobs come from? I suppose we'll need more doctors to care for sick children, since the FDA will be prohibited from monitoring the safety of baby formula. We will need caregivers, I'm sure, willing to provide free care for older Americans, as Medicare will be unable to change its payments to providers. And we'll need new water treatment plant workers, as corporate polluters will have increased freedom to dump harmful chemicals into our drinking water as they have for years. If I sound extreme, Mr. Speaker, it's because this bill is extreme. A blanket prohibition on new regulations is not any kind of solution to grow our economy. The FDA, the EPA, and Veterans Administration, these agencies are not responsible for the failure of our jobless recovery. What is irresponsible is the failure to address the real needs of the American people. Rather than preventing the federal government from ensuring clean drinking water, we ought to be investing in the infrastructure that makes clean drinking water possible and that desalinates salt water. We ought to be invested in economic development projects in the national infrastructure, in clean energy technology, in education, and in the kinds of programs that support those Americans who are struggling the hardest. Rich CEOs of big polluters aren't one of those that are in need. But speaking of rich CEOs out of touch with everyday Americans, it was Mitt Romney who said in 2009 that, and I quote him, "You have to have regulation," end of quote. He said that regulations need to be modernized, reviewed, and effective, and that Republicans, and I quote Mr. Romney again, misspeak when they say they don't like regulation. I guess what Mitt Romney calls misspeak, other people might call outright ridiculous, because that is what the ideology behind this bill is. It is as ridiculous a notion that yet more drilling for oil will somehow, drilling in these places where places like BP can companies like BP can cause the kind of incidents that we saw in the Gulf, that somehow this is going to benefit the country. It won't. The other bill to be considered under this rule is just the latest manifestation of the Republican energy doctrine. Only drilling all the time and everywhere. This legislation does exactly two things. It tears up environmental protections, and it further enriches oil company executives. The House, under the Republican majority, has taken 142 pro-oil and gas drilling votes this Congress. Using the hourly cost of voting in the House as calculated by the Congressional Research Service, the more than 90 hours we have spent debating these measures that everybody in this House knew were going nowhere when they left this House, we've spent $54 million of the taxpayers' money debating, and these are the people that will tell me they want to cut costs. I suppose, Mr. Speaker, that there's always a chance that the Republicans will, that in 43rd time, an additional hours that they try something. But once again, the majority's efforts reflect a dogged determination to rely on an outdated ideology that seeks only to reward the wealthiest corporations. We are already drilling at historic levels in this country. The United States is home to more offshore drilling rigs than the entire rest of the world combined. 70% of offshore areas currently leased are not even active yet. This legislation isn't going to change the price of fuel for the average American. It does not mandate that oil drill in the United States. Mr. Markey brought an amendment that allowed that if it's going to be drilled here, it ought to stay here. But this legislation doesn't allow for it to even be sold in the United States. In fact, oil will simply be shipped out to the highest bidder, similar to what's going to happen with Keystone when it's completed on the world market, generating enormous profits for the oil companies while sticking the American public with the bill. I recently saw an editorial cartoon by Joel Peck, and in the cartoon a man stands up at a climate change summit and asks, what happens if climate change is indeed a hoax, but we achieve energy independence anyway, that we preserve the environment anyway, that we create green jobs anyway, and livable cities, and have cleaner air and water? The answer, of course, is that we will all be better off. Republicans can stick their heads in the tar sands all they want, but pumping more fossil fuels out of the ground and into the atmosphere will not sustain the American economy nor provide the kind of economic prosperity that will benefit all Americans. And as I've said before, and I repeat again, I'll be the last person standing against drilling in the offshore of Florida. At the same time, preventing the federal government from acting on behalf of public health and safety will not create new jobs. It won't return the unemployment rate to 6%, and it won't send a signal to the American public that their elected representatives are ably minding public resources. I reserve the balance of my time.